You wouldn't believe what happened when I walked into my daughter-in-law's family's house, pretending to be poor and naive. What I thought was going to be a humiliating experience turned into something I never expected. The day had arrived, and I couldn't shake the nerves that gripped my chest. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, had invited me to her family's house for the first time. She had always spoken of her parents with such admiration. Their wealth, their high status, their polished way of life. She never once mentioned how they would view me. Though, my thoughts were a whirlwind as I tried to make sense of the situation. You see, my relationship with Sarah wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Don't get me wrong. I loved my son, Ollie, and I adored Sarah in my own way. But the two of us had never really clicked. We were worlds apart. Sarah, raised in a family of professionals and high society, seemed to belong to a world that was as foreign to me as the moon. Her polished speech, her well-maintained manners, and her perfectly styled appearance made me feel small and out of place. But despite all this, I wanted to make things work. I wanted her to like me, to see that I wasn't just a simple, rural mother. But how? The thought of meeting her family had me in a tight grip of anxiety. Would they look down on me? Would they think I wasn't good enough for their precious Sarah? I didn't have a fancy job or an impressive background. I wasn't from the same social circle. And I certainly didn't have the luxuries that seemed to define their world. I couldn't let that be the reason for any tension between us. And then, the idea came to me. I decided I would play the role of the naive, poor, simple mother. I would be humble, almost to the point of meekness. I would make it seem like I came from a modest background, with little understanding of the finer things in life. Maybe, just maybe, that would allow me to win their affection. I could already hear my own voice in my head, practicing how I would speak in front of them, how I would act in their elegant home. Sarah's family was everything I wasn't. Rich, cultured, and impeccably groomed. But I had something they didn't. Or so I thought. Humility. I could be meek, innocent, and naive. So much so that they wouldn't even see the real me. They would pity me. Yes, but they would also see me as harmless, perhaps even endearing. They might feel the need to protect me, and in doing so, I hoped they would accept me. That morning, as I stood in front of the mirror, I made my preparations. I carefully selected a simple dress that didn't look too flashy, but also not too old-fashioned. I didn't want to seem too out of touch, but I didn't want to seem like I was trying too hard either. My hair was left loose, unstyled, and I applied the slightest amount of makeup, enough to look presentable, but not enough to seem extravagant. I didn't want to overdo it. It was the perfect balance of simplicity and unpretentiousness. Sarah had warned me that her parents were traditional, and that they valued formalities. They were kind people, she said, but they could be a little judgmental of people they considered beneath them. She didn't outright say it, but I could sense the tension in her words. I was to be on my best behavior, as I always had been around her. But this time, it was different. I was going to be someone I wasn't. As we drove to their house, I could feel the knots in my stomach tightening. The house was in an affluent neighborhood, far from my humble little home. The roads were lined with tall trees, and the houses on either side were grand, with neatly manicured lawns and high walls that promised privacy. This was a different world, one I wasn't sure I would fit into. When we arrived, Sarah's parents greeted us warmly. As expected, they were everything I had imagined. Her father, Mr. Ashraf, was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit, and exuded an air of authority. Her mother, Mrs. Ashraf, was elegant and graceful, her clothing impeccable, and her hair styled to perfection. They were both much older than me, but their youthfulness shone through in their energy and sophistication. I couldn't help but feel small in comparison. I had worked hard all my life, but I wasn't used to this kind of wealth. The house itself was a mansion, with grand chandeliers, polished wooden floors, and walls adorned with expensive art. It smelled of fresh flowers, and there was an undertone of wealth in every corner. The dining table was set with delicate china, and the glasses sparkled in the light. I couldn't help but stare at it all. The elegance, the decor, the way Sarah's parents moved so effortlessly in this environment. Everything seemed so perfect. And then there was me, sitting there, feeling like an imposter. I began my act as soon as I walked through the door. I spoke softly, almost shyly, introducing myself in the most humble way possible. I mentioned how I was from a small village, with not much to my name. I didn't elaborate too much on our struggles, but I did let them know that I wasn't accustomed to the luxuries they enjoyed. I didn't want them to think I was hiding anything. I was honest about the fact that I had always focused on raising my children and had never had the time for any kind of fancy lifestyle. At first, Mr. Ashraf and Mrs. Ashraf seemed to respond well. They asked questions about my life, my background, and my experiences. I answered, trying to sound humble, but not too much so. I didn't want to come off as pitiful. I was just a mother who loved her son. But as the conversation continued, I noticed that their questions grew more probing. They wanted to know about our financial situation, about how we lived, about what kind of house we had. It was clear that they were trying to size me up, to figure out how I would fit into their world. As I spoke, I kept my eyes lowered, glancing at my hands and fidgeting nervously. I didn't make eye contact for too long, afraid that if I did, they would see through the act. I felt their eyes on me, but I didn't dare meet them head on. I was careful not to speak too much, letting them do most of the talking. I played the role of the quiet, humble mother who had nothing to prove. The longer I stayed, the more I realized something unexpected. They weren't judging me. In fact, they seemed rather kind. Mrs. Ashraf spoke with a gentle tone, and Mr. Ashraf listened intently, showing genuine interest in the little details of my life. It was the exact opposite of what I had feared. They weren't dismissing me or making me feel small. They didn't look down on me for my simplicity. Instead, they listened as though they valued what I had to say. But still, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. I was pretending to be something I wasn't. The guilt weighed heavily on me as I played the role of the humble, naive mother. I didn't belong in their world. But here I was, trying to force myself into it. By the time dinner was served, I could feel the tension in my shoulders easing. It was a lavish meal, with multiple courses and delicious dishes that I could never have prepared myself. But the strangest thing happened. The more I tried to act humble, the more they treated me with respect. They were kind and thoughtful, asking about my life, my experiences, and even my thoughts on certain matters. They didn't care about my background, or the fact that I didn't come from wealth. They wanted to get to know the real me. As I sat at the table, quietly picking at my food, I realized something profound. My act wasn't necessary. They weren't judging me the way I thought they would. It wasn't about what I had or didn't have. It was about who I was. And in that moment, I learned that I didn't need to pretend to be someone I wasn't. They weren't interested in the fake version of me. They wanted to know the real person sitting before them. As the evening wore on, I found myself gradually letting my guard down. For so long, I had been on edge, constantly calculating every word, every gesture, every glance. But the more I observed Sarah's family, the more I realized that the warmth they offered was real. It wasn't what I had expected at all. I had imagined that I would be judged, that they would look at me with disdain, as though I were beneath them. After all, in my mind, I was nothing like them. My life had been full of struggle, hard work, and sacrifice. I wasn't polished or well-spoken, and I certainly wasn't wealthy. But as the evening went on, I began to see the cracks in the image I had built of Sarah's family. And with each passing moment, I couldn't help but feel more and more uncomfortable with the role I was playing. At first, Mr. Ashraf, Sarah's father, made an effort to be polite. He asked about my village, about my upbringing, about how I had raised my children. His questions were kind, but probing. I knew what he was doing. He was trying to figure me out. In his world, people like me didn't he belong. And yet, there he was, asking me questions with genuine interest. I had always heard that people from higher social classes looked down on those who were less fortunate. But here he was, treating me like an equal. His demeanor wasn't condescending. It was just different. It was as if he was trying to understand me in a way I hadn't expected. I could see the curiosity in his eyes. And it wasn't just about me being Ollie's mother. It was about something more. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but it felt like he was trying to break through the wall I had built around myself. I felt exposed. Mrs. Ashraf, on the other hand, was a bit quieter, but she watched me closely, her eyes scanning my every move, as if she was analyzing me. I had heard from Sarah that her mother was meticulous, always observing people before making her judgment. I braced myself for criticism, for some hidden comment or a raised eyebrow that would make me feel small. But as the conversation continued, I noticed something different. Her gaze softened when she looked at me, and her smile, though reserved, seemed genuine. It was as if she was trying to make me feel at ease. And for the first time that evening, I felt a sense of comfort creeping in. I didn't know how to explain it, but I could feel that she was giving me a chance. Not because I was playing the role of the humble, poor mother, but because she was actually interested in who I was. As the dinner progressed, I kept thinking about how this situation had unfolded. I had expected to be treated like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. I had expected them to look at me as if I were some simple, unrefined person who had no place in their sophisticated world. But that wasn't happening. Instead, they were treating me with kindness, respect, and even curiosity. It made me question my assumptions about them, assumptions that had been built on nothing more than my own insecurities. One of the most surprising moments of the evening came when Mr. Ashraf asked me about my own experiences as a mother. At first, I hesitated. I didn't think they would understand. What did they know about the struggles of raising children without the help of nannies or tutors? What could they possibly understand about the hard work that went into providing for a family when you had nothing but your own two hands to rely on? But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something unexpected. He wasn't just asking because it was polite. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know. He was asking because he saw something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself. I found myself opening up, speaking about the challenges I had faced while raising Ollie, how we had lived on a tight budget, how I had worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet, how I had sacrificed so much for the sake of my children's futures. I told him about the times I had to go without just to ensure that they had what they needed. I told him about the sleepless nights, the worry that never left, the moments when I felt like giving up. But I never did because I couldn't. I had to keep going for them. And as I spoke, I noticed that his expression wasn't one of judgment, but of understanding. It wasn't sympathy either. It was something deeper, a recognition of the strength it took to live the life I had lived. Mrs. Ashraf, though still quiet, nodded along as I spoke. Her eyes seemed to soften even more, and I could see that she, too, was taking in my words. She didn't interrupt, but her gaze was attentive, as though she were genuinely considering what I had to say. At that moment, I realized that they weren't just tolerating me. They were actually listening, and that was something I hadn't expected. But even with all the warmth and kindness, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. I was still playing a part. I had become so used to acting humble, acting poor, that I had forgotten how to simply be myself. I had gotten caught up in the idea that they would never accept me unless I downplayed my own identity. I had convinced myself that if I showed them the real me, the woman who had worked hard all her life, who was proud of her accomplishments, they would reject me. But that wasn't happening. They weren't rejecting me at all. They were engaging with me, trying to understand me, trying to make me feel like part of their family. I realized, with a jolt, that it wasn't them I needed to worry about. It was me. I had built this wall between us, this barrier of insecurity, because I thought I wasn't good enough for them. But in reality, it was my own self-doubt that had kept me from truly connecting with them. They weren't the ones judging me. I was judging myself. As the evening drew to a close, I felt a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, I felt relieved. The evening had gone better than I had expected, far better than I had hoped. But on the other hand, I felt a pang of guilt. I had acted like someone I wasn't, and I had hidden the parts of myself that I should have been proud of. I had allowed my fear of rejection to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I had missed out on the chance to be my authentic self. I hadn't realized it at the time, but I had been hiding from them, afraid of what they might think. And in return, they had given me something that I hadn't expected. Acceptance. It wasn't until the end of the evening, as Sarah and I were leaving, that I finally allowed myself to reflect on what had just happened. She thanked me for coming and gave me a warm hug. I could tell she was happy that everything had gone well. And as we drove home, I couldn't help but think that I had learned something important. It wasn't about pretending to be someone else or acting like I didn't belong. It was about accepting myself for who I was, flaws and all, and realizing that if they truly wanted to get to know me, they would do so on my terms, not on the terms of some idealized version of myself. In the end, I wasn't the naive, poor mother they thought I was. I was just a mother. A strong, resilient woman who had worked hard for everything she had. And as I reflected on that evening, I realized that sometimes the best way to connect with people is not by pretending to be someone you're not, but by simply being true to who you are. The evening had already taken an unexpected turn. What I had feared would be a disastrous encounter with Sarah's family had instead unfolded with a surprising level of warmth and understanding. As I sat there at the dinner table, still trying to process my emotions and what had just transpired, a sense of curiosity began to creep in. There were still so many unknowns about Sarah's family that I hadn't yet understood. I had gone into this evening with preconceived notions, assumptions, and even a few fears. But as the night continued, I felt a growing sense of intrigue about the people I had just met. What was the truth about them? What was hidden beneath the surface? I had always known that Sarah came from a wealthy family. It was something she had mentioned on more than one occasion, albeit in a way that seemed almost casual. She had never once bragged about her family's wealth, nor had she ever made me feel inferior because of it. But even with her casual remarks, I had always wondered how they lived. I had heard about their luxurious vacations, their expensive tastes in furniture and clothing, and the ease with which they moved through life. To me, it always seemed as though they lived in a world so far removed from my own that it was hard to imagine anything else. I had assumed that their wealth defined them, that it shaped who they were as people. But as the evening wore on, I began to see a different picture. Mr. Ashraf, for all his poised and polished exterior, had a kindness about him that was difficult to ignore. He had asked me so many questions about my life, my village, my children, and my struggles. At first, I had assumed that he was simply being polite, but as the night progressed, it became clear to me that there was more to his curiosity than mere social etiquette. There was a genuine interest in what I had to say, and when he spoke about his own experiences, I noticed that he wasn't speaking from a place of superiority. Rather, he seemed to speak from a place of understanding, as though he could relate to the challenges I had faced in some way. He talked about his own upbringing, about the struggles he had endured to build the life he now had. He spoke with humility, not with the arrogance I had expected from someone of his status. And in that moment, I realized that the man I had initially seen as untouchable and distant was, in fact, someone who had worked hard for everything he had achieved. Mrs. Ashraf, Sarah's mother, was equally intriguing. While she hadn't said much during the evening, I could see that she was a woman of substance. Her calm, composed demeanor spoke volumes, but as I watched her interact with her husband, with Sarah, and with me, I noticed something unexpected, a softness that I hadn't anticipated. She didn't speak with the same air of authority that her husband did. Instead, she seemed more concerned with making me feel at ease. with ensuring that I felt welcome in their home. There was a gentleness to her that wasn't immediately apparent, and it left me with a sense of admiration. As the evening progressed, my mind continued to churn with the realization that my assumptions about Sarah's family were not only wrong, but they had also been based on a narrow perspective, one shaped by my own insecurities and fears. I had imagined them as a cold, distant family who saw themselves as superior to anyone outside their circle. I had thought that their wealth and status made them untouchable, that they were somehow different from me. But what I was learning was that they were human. Just like me, they had their own struggles, their own experiences, and their own stories to tell. And in many ways, they had worked just as hard as I had to get to where they were. It wasn't until later that night, when we were sitting in the living room, that the full extent of the truth began to reveal itself. Sarah's parents were not just rich, they were also highly intelligent, well-read, and deeply thoughtful. They were not concerned with impressing others or flaunting their wealth. In fact, they seemed almost uncomfortable with the idea of showing off. Mr. Ashraf spoke about the importance of education, about how he had sacrificed so much to provide his children with the best opportunities. He talked about his belief in hard work, in dedication, and in the value of building something meaningful. It was a philosophy I could relate to deeply. But what struck me most was his admission that despite all his success, he never felt truly at peace. He spoke about the loneliness that came with wealth, the difficulty of finding genuine connections in a world that was obsessed with status. Mrs. Ashraf echoed similar sentiments, though in a more understated way. She spoke of how, despite having everything she could possibly want, she often found herself feeling empty. She talked about the pressure of maintaining appearances, of always being on, of never being able to truly relax because there was always someone watching. I could see the toll that this pressure had taken on her, in her subtle gestures, in the quiet weariness in her eyes. I was beginning to see a side of them that I had never imagined. They weren't perfect. They had their own struggles, their own vulnerabilities, and their own challenges. Their wealth didn't make them immune to the complexities of life. If anything, it had created its own set of problems, ones I had never considered before. As I sat there, listening to their stories and reflecting on my own, I felt a sense of connection that I hadn't expected. I had come into this evening with a preconceived idea of who they were. A wealthy, perfect family who looked down on people like me. But what I was discovering was that they were just people. They had their flaws, their insecurities, and their difficulties. And perhaps, just like me, they were doing their best to navigate a world that often seemed confusing and uncertain. The more they spoke, the more I realized how much I had misjudged them. I had thought they were hiding behind their wealth, that they used their status as a shield to keep people at a distance. But the truth was, they were just like anyone else, trying to make sense of their lives, trying to find meaning and purpose in a world that often seemed shallow and superficial. I had assumed that their wealth defined them, but in reality, it was just one aspect of who they were. What defined them more than anything was their values, their beliefs, and their desire to make a difference in the world. As the evening came to a close, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. I had walked into that house with so many assumptions, so many fears, and so many walls built up around me. But by the end of the night, I had come to realize that those walls weren't necessary. I didn't need to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I didn't need to hide behind the mask of a poor, naive mother. Sarah's family had shown me that they were more than just their wealth. They were complex, multifaceted people who had lived lives full of both triumphs and challenges. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I wasn't just Ollie's mother. I was a person, just like they were. And for the first time that night, I felt like I belonged. The night was drawing to a close, and the warmth I had initially felt from Sarah's family had started to settle into a deep, reflective kind of calm. I had spent most of the evening trying to fit into a mold that I thought would make me more acceptable to them. A humbled, naive version of myself. The guilt and discomfort that had accompanied me through much of the night began to fade as I noticed the genuine kindness with which they treated me. The walls I had so carefully constructed to protect myself started to crumble. But it wasn't just because of how they had made me feel accepted. It was something else, something far more profound. As I sat there in the living room with Sarah's family, I couldn't help but notice how the conversation shifted. At first, it had been focused on pleasantries and polite exchanges, with everyone asking about my life, my background, and my family. But now, as the evening wore on and the conversation began to feel more natural, the topics became deeper, more personal. It was as if the room itself was inviting us to drop the pretense, to let down our guards. And as I looked around, something in the atmosphere changed, something that made me realize I wasn't the only one hiding behind a facade. Sarah's father, Mr. Ashraf, was the first to shift the tone. He leaned back in his chair and gave a soft, almost wistful smile. "You know," he said, his voice uncharacteristically calm, "when I was younger, I had a completely different life planned. I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. Success, wealth, respect." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the things that mattered most. There was something in the way he said this that made me look at him in a different light. Up until that point, I had assumed that his life had been a linear path, one of steady success, wealth, and upward mobility. I had assumed that someone like him, with his polished demeanor and commanding presence, had everything he needed to be happy. But what he had just said had an entirely different implication. He wasn't speaking from a place of certainty or pride. He was speaking from a place of regret. Mrs. Ashraf, sitting next to him, nodded silently, her gaze softening as she listened. Her usually composed and elegant demeanor had taken on a more vulnerable air. She, too, seemed to be considering something deeply. And it wasn't just the quietness in her expression that caught my attention. It was the way she looked at her husband. There was a tenderness in her eyes, an understanding that spoke volumes about their relationship, about the years they had spent together. It was in that moment that I realized something. These two people, whom I had placed on a pedestal, whom I had thought were untouchable and beyond any kind of struggle, were human. They were no different from me. They had their own regrets, their own shortcomings, their own hidden pains. And as I sat there, listening to Mr. Ashraf speak of his lost dreams and Mrs. Ashraf's quiet acceptance, I began to feel a stirring in my chest, a connection to them that I hadn't anticipated. But it wasn't just them. It was Sarah, too. Throughout the evening, she had been somewhat reserved. She smiled politely, exchanged pleasantries, but there was something about her that seemed off. As I looked at her across the room, I noticed that her posture had shifted. She wasn't the confident, put-together woman I had seen at family gatherings or social events. Instead, she looked smaller somehow, more introspective. It was as if something within her had been stirred by her parents' words, a realization that perhaps we were all more alike than we had let on. As if sensing the change in the air, Sarah suddenly spoke up. "You know," she said, looking down at her hands, "I've always felt like I had to be perfect. I've always had to live up to everyone's expectations. Not just my parents, but my own. It's like I had this image of myself in my head, and I couldn't ever let it slip. I think I've been pretending too." Her voice faltered for a moment, as though the admission was something she had never spoken aloud before. "I've always wanted to live up to what my family expects, to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife. But sometimes, I don't know who I am without all those layers." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Here was the woman I had always seen as the epitome of success, the one who had it all together. She was beautiful, intelligent, and from what I could see, had everything she could ever need. But hearing her say this, hearing her admit that she, too, had been hiding behind an image of herself, was like a revelation. I suddenly realized that the pressure she faced was not so different from the pressure I had placed on myself all these years. She, too, had been pretending, just as I had been. We had both been playing roles, trying to live up to some ideal, some version of ourselves that we thought others wanted to see. And in that moment, I understood how much we all carry these invisible burdens, these expectations that weigh us down without us even realizing it. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the moment. No one spoke for several minutes. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one that felt profound, almost sacred. It was as if we were all processing what had just been shared. I had gone into this evening convinced that I was the only one who had to hide parts of myself, who had to pretend to be something I wasn't in order to fit in. But now, I saw that we were all carrying our own facades. Sarah, her parents, even me. We were all pretending in some way. It was then that I realized how much I had underestimated them, how much I had let my own insecurities dictate my perceptions. I had assumed that, because they lived in a world of wealth and privilege, they were immune to the struggles that came with self-doubt and fear. But as it turned out, they were just like me. They, too, were caught in a web of expectations, of roles they felt they had to play. They, too, had moments of doubt, moments where they wondered if they were enough. They, too, had been pretending. As I sat there, I felt a shift within myself. The burden of pretending, of being someone I wasn't, began to lift. I realized that I didn't need to wear this mask any longer. I didn't need to be the poor, naive mother to gain their approval. I didn't need to hide behind some false version of myself to be accepted. In that moment, I saw that being authentic, being real, was the only way to truly connect with others, even with people like Sarah's family, who had seemed so different from me at first. The evening ended not with fanfare or grand gestures, but with a quiet understanding. As Sarah and I left her parents' house, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't the relief of escaping an uncomfortable situation. It was the relief of knowing that I had made it through the night, not by pretending to be someone I wasn't, but by being true to who I was. And as I looked at Sarah, I realized that she, too, had begun to shed the weight of her own pretensions. We were both free. In that moment, from the roles we had been playing for so long, the truth had been revealed to me in the most unexpected way. I wasn't the only one pretending. And in that shared understanding, I found a deeper connection with Sarah and her family than I had ever thought possible. As I left Sarah's family's home that evening, a strange sense of peace began to settle over me. The evening had unfolded in ways I never could have predicted. And in the end, I had learned more than I could have imagined. I had walked in with so many fears, so many insecurities, so many assumptions about how things would unfold. And while the night had initially felt like a test, like a performance that I had to pass in order to be accepted, it had ultimately become something far more profound, an opportunity to reflect on who I was and what I had been pretending to be. The night had started with me donning a mask, pretending to be someone I wasn't. I had carefully crafted an image of a humble, poor, naive mother who had nothing to offer but a simple, modest life. I had expected that by presenting myself this way, I would gain the sympathy and approval of Sarah's family. But as the evening unfolded, I discovered that the mask I had so carefully constructed was unnecessary. They didn't need me to be someone I wasn't. They needed me to be real. It wasn't just about being accepted by Sarah's family, although that was an important part of it. What I came to realize that night was that authenticity is the foundation of any meaningful relationship, whether it's with family, friends, or even strangers. The most powerful connections are built on the truth of who we are, not the personas we create to fit in. And as I sat there, reflecting on my own actions and the way I had shaped myself to meet others' expectations, I began to understand the true power of being authentic. The pressure to be something we're not is a heavy burden, one that many of us carry without even realizing it. We live in a world that constantly pushes us to fit into certain molds, whether it's through societal expectations, cultural norms, or even the influence of social media. We're told to look a certain way, act a certain way, and present ourselves in a way that will make others accept us. But the truth is, no matter how hard we try to fit those molds, we will never feel fully at peace until we learn to embrace who we truly are. For so long, I had been playing a role. I had been pretending to be the humble, poor mother in order to make others feel comfortable around me, to make them see me as someone worthy of their attention and approval. But as the evening with Sarah's family had shown me, that act was not necessary. They didn't need me to play the role of the poor, meek mother. They didn't need me to be anything other than myself. And in that realization, I found a profound sense of relief. I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't in order to be loved or accepted. All I had to do was be myself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much energy I had spent over the years trying to fit into expectations that weren't even my own. I had spent so much of my life trying to live up to the ideals of others, trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law. But in doing so, I had neglected to honor my own truth. I had become so focused on how I was perceived by others that I had lost sight of who I really was and what I truly wanted. It was as if I had been wearing a mask for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be myself without it. But that night, in the presence of Sarah's family, I was reminded of something important. Being authentic isn't just about being true to others. It's about being true to yourself. When we hide behind masks, we not only distance ourselves from others, but we also distance ourselves from the parts of ourselves that matter the most. We shut off the very essence of who we are, thinking that it isn't good enough or worthy of others' love and acceptance. But in truth, it is those very parts, the vulnerable, unpolished, imperfect parts, that make us whole and real. As I reflected on the evening, I also realized how much I had underestimated the power of vulnerability. For so long, I had believed that vulnerability was a weakness, that it made me susceptible to judgment or rejection. But as Sarah's family shared their own moments of vulnerability with me, I began to see that vulnerability is not a sign of weakness at all. In fact, it is one of the most powerful things we can offer in any relationship. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we create space for others to do the same. And in that space, true connection can blossom. I thought about Sarah's admission, the way she had spoken openly about her own struggles with perfectionism and the pressure to live up to others' expectations. I thought about Mr. Ashraf's reflection on his own life and the regrets he had about chasing success at the expense of the things that truly mattered. I thought about Mrs. Ashraf's quiet strength and how she had opened up in her own way about the burdens that came with maintaining appearances. In that moment, I realized that they, too, had been hiding behind their own masks, just like I had been. And in their vulnerability, they had allowed me to see them for who they truly were, just as I had been given the opportunity to do the same. It was a powerful reminder that authenticity is not about being perfect. It's not about presenting a flawless version of ourselves to the world. It's about being real, about acknowledging our flaws and imperfections and sharing them with others. It's about being honest with ourselves and with those around us. And in doing so, we create the kind of deep, meaningful relationships that are built on trust, understanding, and acceptance. The lesson I took away from that evening was not just about how to interact with others. It was about how to interact with myself. For so long, I had placed so much pressure on myself to conform to what I thought others wanted me to be. I had spent so much energy trying to be the person I thought I needed to be in order to be loved and accepted. But in the end, it wasn't the mask I wore that made me lovable. It was the truth of who I was, the woman who had worked hard, who had faced challenges, who had loved deeply and fiercely. And in that truth, I found my own worth. As I looked back on the evening, I realized that I had learned something profound. The power of authenticity isn't just about how others perceive us. It's about how we perceive ourselves. When we embrace who we truly are, with all our flaws, our mistakes, our imperfections, we give ourselves the gift of peace. We no longer have to live in the shadows of our own self-doubt and fear. We no longer have to pretend to be someone we were not in order to be accepted. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice the subtle changes in my own behavior. I found myself speaking more honestly, more openly, not just with Sarah's family, but with others in my life as well. I began to let go of the fear that had kept me hiding behind a mask for so long. And as I did, I found that my relationships became deeper, more meaningful. I felt a sense of connection that I hadn't experienced before, not just with others, but with myself. The power of authenticity is transformative. It frees us from the need to live up to others' expectations. It allows us to live in alignment with our own truth. And in doing so, we create relationships that are grounded in honesty and acceptance. I had learned that night that pretending to be something we not may offer temporary comfort, but it is in embracing who we truly are, flaws and all, that we find real peace and connection. And for that, I will always be grateful. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more exciting content with you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more exciting content with you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.